to small countries.
And he was so right that it is the poor and the marginalized that get most affected in times like these. And we often think that is these poor and marginalized people, those at the bottom of the economic ladder, as the only ones needing social safety nets and governmental assistance. But in this crisis, we are witnessing middle-class citizens, those with stable and decent-paying jobs, facing the threat of bankruptcy and the fright of not knowing where the next paycheck will come from or if their job will be secured. Even those persons, too, live on the knife's edge when they get their salary at the end of the month. This crisis has brought out the best in some of us, but it has also brought out the worst. In the early days of this crisis, as I read comments on social media, I remembered my days as a student studying philosophy. I remember the Hobbesian state of nature, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is against this idealization of the natural state of man that John Hobbes made a case for a Leviathan, a sovereign power that would regulate social life and cause people to believe in a commonality of purpose. So it is true that in times like this, people look for leadership. They want hope. They want to be assured that despite the pain and suffering, there will be a better future. Our faith in the Lord helps us. It strengthens us and gives us the hope of seeing each rising sun. But we are also citizens of a country, and we give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and we expect Caesar to deliver to us. And it is with this optimism my constituents awaited the estimates as presented by the Prime Minister. So with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I address this Honorable House on the estimates of expenditure and revenue for the financial year 2020-2021. What was supposed to be the COVID budget? And I want to focus on 4 questions. What is the social and political context within which this budget is presented? Are there any benefits for Kasri South? Does it pass the test for fiscal responsibility? And what does the estimate tell us about the priorities of the government? So I start with the social and political context. I have referred to the threat which our civilization faces. It is an existential threat. This government has been acutely aware that the people of St. Lucia are offended by the unprecedented levels of tribalism, victimization, and non-transparency which has become commonplace in St. Lucia since 2016. This explains the persistent efforts to use themes like I am St. Lucia and we all in to try to engender a sense of nationalism and a feeling of togetherness. It has not worked. Why? Because the actions of this government must be matched with, the words of this government must be matched with actions. And it is because of the failings of this government to match action with words that the people of St. Lucia do not trust this government. Already politicians are not trusted, but through their own fault, they have the lowest ratings of any government. This COVID-19 crisis has given us yet another opportunity to create a more sincere patriotism and unity. So on this side, we embrace the opportunity to work together with the government. We took a decision to halt active politics and give the government all the space it needed to implement an effective COVID response.
When did you do that?
However, we always said that we would not abandon our constitutional responsibility to be the check and balance on the government, to hold the government to account, and where necessary, highlight any shortcomings. And then we waited for meaningful engagement and participation. Truth be told, we were invited to a couple of NEMAC meetings and a stakeholder meeting. And yes, the Prime Minister on some occasions called the leader of the opposition to let him know he was about to address the nation. If there was ever a chance to demonstrate national unity and togetherness in delivering hope and reassurance, it would have been with the presentation of the economic response to the COVID crisis. Just think of it, honorable members, Mr. Speaker. If government and opposition, together with stakeholders, could have met, discussed, and agree on a national economic response, what greater source of inspiration, what mightier presentation of hope, what more visible demonstration of purpose, and what inspiring manifestation of unity that would be. But dreams do not always come true, do they? So you must ask the question, why wasn't an effort made to compile an economic response characterized by a national consensus? Why? Why did the Prime Minister not call the leader of the opposition to inform him of the details of his address to the nation on Sunday? Why? I hope to answer these questions shortly. But first of all, let us discuss if the estimates for the entire financial year as presented was necessary. Let's answer that question first. The Finance Administration Act provides the Minister of Finance with the ability to suspend the budget up to 4 months from the beginning of the financial year. During that time, he has the ability to spend up to 1/3 of the previous year's budget. In any event, the Prime Minister has extraordinary powers, and if there is national consensus, we would have postponed the presentation of these estimates. So there is no need to present a statement of estimates of revenue and expenditure for an entire year right now. There is too much uncertainty about what lays immediately ahead of us. The Prime Minister himself argues that it is not wise at this point to make financial projections. Let me quote him in his address to the nation last Sunday, and I quote, "By September 2020, we will have had a clear assessment of the economic impact of COVID, and only then can we consider making permanent adjustments to our fiscal projections. We will hopefully then be in a position to begin our economic recovery efforts." We all agree everything is fluid right now. We are still under a state of emergency. We still have businesses closed. We are not testing sufficiently. We are not sure if we are coming or going. So how can we reasonably have realistic financial projections? But here what is even more bizarre. Even after having received the estimates for the entire year, we on this side are invited to join a multi-sectoral committee, which we welcome, with the objective of finalizing the economic stimulus strategy and plan. And it goes on, that will assist in the economic recovery of St. Lucia post-COVID-19. So these estimates, which are presented and provides expenditure until March 2021, is not designed to lead to the recovery of St. Lucia post-COVID-19. So the law says the Prime Minister does not have to do it. The Prime Minister himself says it is not wise to do it. Then why is he doing it? Why did he not consult the leader of the opposition on a national economic package for the country? And again, the big question remains, why did he not present instead a COVID-specific statement of estimates for a 4-month period and then frame a national economic response as proposed by the committee that will be built on all stakeholders when, by then, we would have had a greater certainty and understanding? Mr. Speaker, the answer is simple. It is an elections budget. Yes, Mr. Speaker, an elections budget. This is what this represents. And in the context of the COVID crisis, it is entirely unwise, unnecessary, and unrealistic. Surely, an elections budget cannot be a priority right now. Instead, it should be the welfare of the people and the country which have been exposed by COVID. And in this honorable house, a more eloquent orator once described a budget as a cocoa macaque budget that's full of trickery and false idealism. And in many ways, this budget reminds me of this. So, Mr. Speaker, this is the context within which this budget, this estimate is presented. It is an elections budget, Mr. Speaker. But I've looked into it, as I did last year, hopeful that some relief can come to the constituents of Castries South. And as I think, Mr. Speaker, about my constituency, I think of Lower Mon Road, Mr. Speaker, the need for sidewalks, the railings for the bridges, Mr. Speaker. And I'm looking to see whether in this elections budget any such thing is contained. I think of Old Cemetery, Mr. Speaker, an area that I know so very well. The issue of housing, and the member from Castries Central spoke about the chronic need to address housing in the city. I think of the need for drains, retaining walls, footpaths, community lighting, solid waste management, and public upkeep of the area. Never before have we seen our country look as dirty as it is right now, and even before COVID. Fuasho, Mr. Speaker, a favorite place of mine. Every time I drive through and I see the young people playing on the road, football, cricket, a road that, Mr. Speaker, the ambulance would pass frequently. Well, now they've relocated to OKEO. But right there on the road, and I knew just before the change of government, a piece of land was acquired to build a court, Mr. Speaker. And I wish, and I promise those young people that someday they will get their court. Drainage in Fuasho, housing, lighting, solid waste management, Hospital Road itself, footpaths, lighting, retaining walls, George Cooper Road, retaining walls, drainage, Tunnel Road. And Mr. Speaker, at this point I have to express my thanks to the member for Babono, because shortly before the last election, there was a project approved to provide meters for the people in Tunnel Road. Tunnel Road is a community after the first tunnel on the left-hand side. Individuals living there, their meters would be at the top of the mall next to the Governor General's residence. So you can imagine when a pipe bursts or there's an issue and you live down in the fort, you have to trace your line all through the bush, all of the hill to try to find out exactly where it is. And that project had been stopped, and I spoke to the member from Babono, and I assured him that the member from Beaufort North would not say too many things critical of him. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that finally the people in Tunnel Road have gotten all their meters. And they're very, very grateful for it, Mr. Speaker. Very grateful for it. Finally the project has come through. But they have issues, Mr. Speaker, still of land ownership in that area. And I've heard that most of the lands in that area is owned by one of our leading contractors. And I think he can almost go unnoticed that the day the Labour Party gets into office, Mr. Speaker, we will acquire those lands to make sure that the people can finally own their lands there. Because that land has been sold from person to person, and the individuals living on it do not have ownership. Tumaflit, Mr. Speaker, many of you individuals there may not even know where Tumaflit is. I was hoping the member for Castries North was here because he'll be very familiar with this area, Mr. Speaker. Tumaflit. Mr. Speaker, issues of drainage, serious drainage, footpaths, a road passage for persons to be able, because can you imagine to access this community, you either enter from the bottom by the Millennium Highway or at the top by the post office at the top of the hill and walk down about 150 steps to get down to that community, Mr. Speaker. And can you imagine if an ambulance had to carry somebody from down in that hole along there, Mr. Speaker? Lighting, road repair is a serious issue for them. And I had to call on the member for Castres North to do some potholing because the garbage disposal truck would not even go up to that community, creating serious solid waste management issues. Bannon, Mr. Speaker, footpaths, lighting, land ownership, drainage, Mr. Speaker. Tapio Beach needs upgrading. Monla Top, Mr. Speaker, serious land ownership issues again. The entire hillside, persons have been living there for 35, 40 years, and the member from Castres North knows about it because he used to live there. And still no land ownership, Mr. Speaker. Traffic barrier, I have spoken. I took an engineer from the Ministry of Infrastructure, spoke to the member from Castres North. Too many vehicles coming down that hill have entered into people's homes. We all remember when J.K. Fontenelle used to live there, the amount of container trucks before we had Millennium Highway that entered into that house. And vehicles still enter into persons' homes. And we have been asking for traffic barriers, I don't know the technical name for it, to prevent vehicles going into people's homes. Mr. Speaker, Sisera, the state of roads in Monkey Tongue, Mr. Speaker. And before I continue, Bannon Plainfield, the lights at Bannon Plainfield. And can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, one of the lights went bad. One of the lights. I spoke to the Ministry of Youth and Sports. I got a quotation from a contractor to change the lights. The ministry promised to send their own person to do an assessment, about $3,000 to change the lights. And it's been months, an entire football competition. The young people from Fuasho used to take part in the Safe Spaces football competition organized by RISE. And they had to go and play all their matches at the top of La Clery by Kareli, because they could not play at the Plainfield for want of $3,000. But $42 million can be paid through the Don Lockerbie contract, Mr. Speaker. But young people in Fuasho Bannon cannot get $3,000 to change the lights. Cicero Plainfield, Mr. Speaker, before the change of government, there was an approval by the previous parliamentary rep and Minister of Sports to resurface the Cicero Plainfield. That has not been done. I got a quotation from somebody who's done many Plainfields in St. Lucia for the resurfacing to be done. I got lights, I got poles. I got some friends of mine who worked with the utility company to give me an old generator. We repaired the generator. I got Lucelec to agree to provide the wiring, but they would only do it on condition that the ministry said they could go ahead and do the lighting. I wrote to the Ministry of Youth and Sports, to the minister as well. I wrote a second letter, and to date, no response, no approval given. It's more than a year. More than a year. And right now, Mr. Speaker, I also have an outdoor gym for the Cicero Plainfield to erect on the field, but it cannot be done because if you're going to resurface, if you're going to do, and you need the approval to get it done. And I've done all of that because the young people of Cicero have requested they need upgrade to their playing field. But it will come one day. One day, it will come, Mr. Speaker. The playing court in Cicero, and think about Cicero, Mr. Speaker. This is a community of more than 2,000 people just in the lower part. If you take Cicero from the top of the hill all the way to the bottom of Monkey Tongue, you're probably talking about 3,500 to 4,000 people. It's as big as some constituencies, I must say. There's one playing court, which is in a very bad state. And one playing field that is so small, you cannot put a full-size football team to play on it. It's 8-a-side you have to play. The community center has been closed for more than 2 years because of the state of the center. Downstairs is a preschool, which is frequently broken into, and the upstairs has been condemned because of the conditions of it. More than 2 years. And I'm still in hope that something will be done, but if it's not done, one day it will be done. There was Wi-Fi in the community in 2016. There was Wi-Fi, part of some pilot project. And all of a sudden I'm hearing Wi-Fi is being spread all over the island. But Cicero doesn't have Wi-Fi anymore. Doesn't have Wi-Fi anymore. Goodlands, land ownership, Mr. Speaker, roads, playing field, where the young people used to play at the bottom. A particular member in here authorized putting container trailers there instead, and the young people playing area. And we had a cross debate in this house last year about this. The young people still have no playing area, Mr. Speaker. And I can go on. Ticola with drainage and lighting. Basse Joseph, road lighting, footpaths, side roads. The community center at Basse Joseph. 2 Christmas ago, finally I believe somebody was going to come and finish off the community center. But apparently there was a small CDP contract given to a few persons who came there and they did some plastering, and they've just, since then they've never come back to finish off the project. But that's for another day. Marigot, the main road in Marigot, Mr. Speaker, it continues to be an issue for the people. And Marigot is one of the major tourism attractions in St. Lucia. And the state of the road, in particular Marigot and Basse Joseph, is disheartening, Mr. Speaker. I have noticed, Mr. Speaker, an allocation in the Department of Infrastructure, page 238, 239, of $100 million for road improvement and maintenance. And I'm hoping somehow consideration can be given to the rehabilitation of roads in Goodlands, in Basse Joseph, Marigot Main Road, and the rehabilitation of roads in Monkey Town. Mr. Speaker, I have made mention of the court in Fuasho and the resurfacing of the playing field. On page 604, there is provision for a national sporting infrastructural development for $11 million. No details are given of what that money will be spent on. Interestingly, it is already stated that $19.5 million have already been spent. This project totals $32 million. Of course, we know that's the famous Packer Sports contract represented by Don Lockerbie. And I must ask on behalf of St. Lucians, what have the people of St. Lucia gotten so far that is worth $19 million? I know there's works going on in Soufrière, but $19 million have been spent. And another $11 million is provided for in the estimates. Again, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned it last year and I'll repeat it. The omission in the estimates of any repair or establishment or construction of any multi-purpose court, any playing field, any sports equipment, or any capital spending in the Department of Youth and Sports. It is either that the department does not engage in such activities, or they are deliberately being left out. I believe, regardless of whether it's National Lottery is funding it, we should go back to the days when in the budget you can see for the year which courts will be repaired or built, which playing fields will be built or repaired, how much has been spent on sports equipment, how much has been spent on elite athletes, how much has been spent on talent identification. I move on, Mr. Speaker, page 536. Allocation of $17 million under the Constituency Development Program. And I think my colleagues have already expressed our position on the Constituency Development Program. And I know a few projects have been done in Castries South. And in all the cases, they were represented by the candidate who lost against me. In Monlatok has had some footpaths. Marigot has had some footpaths. Basse Joseph have had a drain and a couple things. Nobody consults me. But it is what it is, Mr. Speaker, because one day our people will get their fair share of the Constituency Development Program. I have been told by the minister responsible for the CDP that the day I think he said it in the House, prove to him how much he got, he will give us the same. You're not hurting me. You're not hurting me, you're hurting the people in the constituency. And if I'm supposed to cry, And maybe, Mr. Speaker, if I knew if I cried I would get, I would cry for my people. But I know if I cry, I will still not get. Such is the nature of the politics. But one day, the people will get. I noticed, Mr. Speaker, on page 596, a substantial amount under the PROUD program and the National Sites and Services program. And I've made mention of the situation in Old Cemetery, Banan, Monlatok, and Goodlands. And I'm hoping somehow or the other, some good fortune will come their way and they will get some assistance. I listened to the member from Rosalie who spoke about the community after-school program. And I'm disappointed that the allocation has not been increased because, like he said, this is a critical program. And it has been expanded to other communities, but we've not seen the corresponding increase in an allocation in the budget for it. And you can find that on page 394. I noted also, and I listened to the member from Rosalie, on page 395, the Youth Empowerment for Life project was increased from 2.4 million to 3.1. And the last time I asked, they told me Castries South was not included. I'm hoping if this increase, Castries South will now be included, and there can be more programs for young people in Castries South. I noticed, Mr. Speaker, BNTF funding was used to build some roads in Goodlands. But under the new BNTF on page 395, there's apparently nothing for Goodlands to finish that project which was started. The project went as far as by Miss Ann House, but it needs to go further to the Moors, and it has stopped. And I'm hoping, well, I'm not sure the minister will have another chance in the next budget to include it, because we will be the ones deciding what's in the next budget, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, it is a sad miss for Castries South. Mr. Speaker, I notice that the summer stimulus the stimulus for summer and Christmas has been decreased from 6 million to 4 million. And I'm asking the member for Rosalie, how could he have allowed the stimulus money to be decreased? There's so many people that look forward to the little beautification and step work to get a dollar in their pocket, to help their children go to school, to buy books, to buy uniform, to buy something for Christmas. No, it was put somewhere else. So, but I'm saying this is an established program, and Mr. Speaker, it was reduced. I'm not sure why. The minister probably knows best. Mr. Speaker, I'm not asking for anything extravagant for my constituents, but just what they are deserved and entitled to from their government to meet at least their basic needs. So, Mr. Speaker, let me return to the broader provisions in the budget, Mr. Speaker. And I want to ask the question, does these estimates meet the test of fiscal responsibility? And Mr. Speaker, can you help me? How much more time do I have? I can proceed. Okay. Mr. Speaker, you would recall that this government, the United Workers' Party government, during its campaign, promised the people of St. Lucia that it would not be borrowing money. This government said that. And when we reminded them in this house, they said what they meant, that they will not borrow unless they had a new revenue stream to repay the loan. That's what they said. That's what they said. And they condemned the member from Beaufort South for all his borrowing. But, Mr. Speaker, under this government, we've seen the most outrageous borrowing ever in the history of St. Lucia. The most outrageous. And I want you, Mr. Speaker, I notice you have a few past estimates before you, to get the estimates, and any St. Lucian, I ask you to do it. Get the estimates for 2016, 2017, 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019, and 2019, 2024. It shows that this government has already borrowed $978 million. $978 million. And when I add this year's borrowing requirement of $559 million, This is a grand total of $1.33 billion. I didn't make up those figures. I did not make up those figures. They are in the estimates. I will deal with debt to GDP in the policy statement and expose why these people of Central do not trust this government. And we'll come to that a little later on. So when you now add to $1.338 billion, $700 million for the airport loan, that will take this government borrowing to at least $2 billion. $2 billion. I've not added all yet. Based on the estimates, the last 4 estimates, and you can do the maths, Mr. Speaker, $1.33 billion already borrowed by this government. And then when you add the 700, $2 billion so far. Well, not so far because the year is just started. With those figures, Mr. Speaker, and I want to tell a member from Saltibus, Soufre Saltibus, that with those levels of borrowing, Soufre Force Jacques, with those figures, you should be enjoying high levels of growth, not 1.7% last year. You should have solid reserves and not be bankrupt 2 weeks into COVID that you cannot pay salaries. You should have the lowest unemployment, not 23%. It's an improvement. 16. It should be like 6. When you borrow $2 billion, Mr. Speaker, and the member from Miko North pointed out, this government has had expenditure of over $7 billion since they came into government. You're supposed to have a strong, robust economy.
Honorable member, you're referring to the member for Denry North.
Yeah, from Denry North. What did I say?
Miko North.
Miko North. Denry North. Denry North. You're supposed to have a strong, robust economy. But hear what the Prime Minister said on Sunday night. In fact, we were on the verge of a major takeoff when COVID hit, and the numbers are there to substantiate it. Let me repeat. We were on the verge of a major takeoff when COVID hit, and the numbers are there to substantiate it. Forget, Mr. Speaker, that 2 weeks after COVID, they can't pay salaries, huh? But let's put that aside for now. So let's look at the numbers. But before I do, Mr. Speaker, I need to express my disappointment with the analysis presented in the Social and Economic Review. And I need the technical people from the department to hear me on this. From last year, I commented that it was becoming a political rather than a statistical document. Its narrative had become normative rather than descriptive. Let me point out to you what I'm saying. On page 62, it states that the overall fiscal deficit increased, and that was due to continued growth in total expenditure coupled with a weakened performance owing to adverse impact of COVID-19 in the last quarter of the fiscal year. They are saying the fiscal year ends March. It goes on to state that overall revenue collection in 2019-2020 was dampened by comparatively lower receipts in the last 2 months of the fiscal year, associated with a sharp drop in economic activity due to border closures and scaled-down operations induced by global outbreak of COVID-19. This is dishonest, Mr. Speaker. The last quarter is January to March. January to March. We close our borders on March 23rd. I traveled in the first week of March on a British Airways flight that was full of tourists arriving. There was no closure of our borders in February. There was no scaled-down operation due to COVID in February. But somebody will put in an official document of this House that revenue decline in the last quarter due to the adverse effects of COVID and scaled-down operations. We close our borders on the 23rd of March. There was no effect of COVID on revenue to that extent, Mr. Speaker. If there was any, But that's in a document, a statistical document. But Mr. Speaker, you know, I want to refer you to the document which that same department presented to the trade unions in justifying why there should be a salary cut. And to show you that the trend of declining revenue started in the first 6 months of the financial year. The document shows, and it's not a document of the House, I can make it a document of the House, but it's this government's document that they shared with the trade unions. That document shows that the actual receipts of revenue and grants for the first 6 months of 2019 was already $93 million less than 2018. Let me just say that again.
One quick question, Your Honourable Member. Is there any way you could identify that document so it could go into the record?
Yeah, I have it, Mr. Speaker. I mean, you want the page or the entire document? I'm all members on this side, I'm aware of it, so.
But for parliamentary purposes.
For parliamentary purposes. So, the presentation to trade unions. This document shows, in the first 6 months of 2019, revenue was already $93 million less than in 2018. So the decline in revenue started before COVID. But the Social and Economic Review will tell you it's because of COVID and closure of the airports, which took place on March 23rd, 1 week before the financial year ended. That's what caused revenue to drop in this document, Mr. Speaker. But let's go back to the numbers that the Prime Minister boasted about. Because he said we were on the verge of takeoff before COVID hit us and everything crashed. I'll just give you a sample of some figures, Mr. Speaker. Current surplus. In March 2016, it was $81.4 million surplus. In March 2019, it was $23 million in surplus. It declined from March 2016, when the Labour Party was in power, to 23.3 in March 2019. In March 2020, it's a deficit of $30 million. You can go back to the estimates and find it, Mr. Speaker. These are all documents of the House. Let's look at recurrent surplus. Go back to the estimates. In March 2016, recurrent surplus, that heading, it was deficit $47 million. In March 2019, last year, it was deficit of $100.4 million. In March 2020, it was deficit of $163 million. I'm not talking about COVID effect and next year. I'm just talking about the past. Worsening figures. The primary surplus in March 2016, it was $29.9 million. In March 2019, it was $78 million. In March 2020, it was minus $16 million. And they tell you, Mr. Speaker, we were on the verge of a takeoff, Mr. Speaker. Does that sound, Mr. Speaker, like a takeoff about to happen? Or is it not a nosedive crash that COVID exposed? Mr. Speaker, let's take a further look at some of the figures. We are told that the revenue decline was due to COVID, and I've gone through it. But critical to that was CIP revenue, Mr. Speaker. CIP revenue. It was budgeted that CIP would have brought in $65.8 million. Page 7. It brought in $28 million. And last year I stood in this house and I said to the government, they could never earn $65 million through the CIP. Never. Because the earnings for the previous year was artificial because of range. But let's leave that alone, Mr. Speaker, because my time is running out. This year, the Prime Minister says he will get from the National Economic Fund $30 million. And the member from Constituency is dealt with that this year. I cannot see if last year in better times, you could have only earned $28 million, but this year you will earn $40 million. How is it possible? But the CIP surplus of $3 million that was given to this government could have been a lot more. But they don't tell us about the legal settlements that had to take place by CIP and how much was paid in legal settlements. But that's a story for another day, Mr. Speaker. But why is the government confident that it can raise $30 million? And you're hearing out there in the marketplace that this government, in all the COVID crisis, is making a deal with Henley and partners. And listen to me carefully, Mr. Speaker. Represented by one Dr. Stefan. The same Dr. Stefan, on the eve of the elections, issued an international bulletin saying that the St. Lucia CIP was the worst in the world. And today, he's negotiating to finalize an agreement with this government to take over our CIP.
Honorable Member, you have 15 minutes in which to complete.
Mr. Speaker, but we'll talk more about CIP and Henley, because I'm hearing we now have to pay Henley to go and market our CIP for us. We're going to be paying Henley to go and market for us up front, plus commission on how many files they bring, plus the collecting commission as authorized agents. But more details will come out when the whispers get louder and I hear them. Mr. Speaker, 15 minutes. You know, my fourth question is, what does the estimate tell us about the priority of the government? And I want, Mr. Speaker, for us to look at, if this is supposed to be the economic response, Mr. Speaker, to the COVID crisis, the first question you have to ask is, what's in this budget for COVID? Because this is the budget that's supposed to respond to COVID. You look at Ministry of Health and Wellness, the primary agency, on page 603, there is $13 million for COVID, $13 million for COVID. So monies will be spent on building and infrastructure, on plant and machinery, on salaries, $2.76 million on salaries. I'm not sure who that will be paid those extra salaries for COVID at the Ministry of Health. I don't know. I can only assume, because I thought all the staff was regular staff. But I'm sure there's a logical explanation. You don't allocate $2.76 million out of your COVID allocation for salaries if there is not a good enough reason. So I'm sure there's a good enough reason. Could be the QMs, yeah, could be. But Mr. Speaker, I'm looking at monies to finance COVID, and I'm seeing a grant from the private sector of $2.5 million. And I'm wondering, is that the same Telethon money? A grant from the private sector of $2.5 million, the Telethon raised $2.5 million. But in that $2.5 million, 1.5 goes to the Ministry of Health, and 1 million goes to the National Feeding Program in the Office of the Prime Minister. And I will say one thing, Mr. Speaker. I sincerely hope that the Telethon money is not being taken to pay the Massey bill. I really hope not. Because St. Lucians were told that those monies were for frontline workers, to buy PPE for police officers, for nurses, for doctors, and people on the front line. But 1.5 is going to the Ministry for Supplies, and 1 million is going to the Office of the Prime Minister for a national feeding program. On that note, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister announced on Sunday that they will be providing 10,000 meals daily for 6 weeks. When is this supposed to start? There was a feeding Easter Sunday. There was one last Sunday. There was supposed to be one today, which was cancelled. And I have members opposite thanking everybody for assisting in this program. But today's one was cancelled. 10,000 meals daily for 6 weeks is $23 per meal. $23 per meal. I think that money can be better used by paying restaurants in communities to cook and give people the meals if necessary. But at $23 a meal, that's too much money to be paid. In any event, Mr. Speaker, to use our volunteers, to be going out every day for 6 weeks to give out meals increases their exposure, increases their risk, and puts a lot of strain on them. It might be better to give packages to individuals so that they can, Mr. Speaker, be able to feed.
Honorable Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when you go through the budget, there is only $45.7 million that have been allocated for COVID-19. Let me repeat that. This entire COVID budget has only $45.7 million allocated for COVID. The monies I mentioned, the Ministry, Department of Wellness, the Prime Minister's Office, $1 million for National Feeding Program. The Prime Minister's Office has income support of $24.1 million. I assume that's for the non-NIC contributors. And there is under the Agricultural Assistance Program $7.3 million. Only $45.7 million. Mr. Speaker, in times like this, we need leadership that is caring, is sensitive, and feels the pain of the people. This government is lacking in empathy and sensibility. Mr. Speaker, if you doubt me, reflect on this. Why is the CCC laying off workers? Who are the CCC workers? They are among the lowest paid workers in the country, but provide one of the most important services. And Mr. Speaker, the CCC blames it on COVID. We are also told, Mr. Speaker, that despite sending home half of the staff at CCC, the sanitation and upkeep of the city will not be compromised. If you can send home half your staff and the sanitation upkeep will not be compromised, it really makes you wonder. But Mr. Speaker, the CCC is a corporation that inherited millions of dollars in reserves when they came in 2016, and shares in Lucilec, which was sold, and we were told would be put aside for capital investment. And now the CCC cannot pay workers, and they're going to send them home. What about the Prime Minister's announcement that government will be giving statutory bodies monies, millions of dollars, to pay salaries? Why isn't the CCC getting money to keep some of the lowest paid workers who provide one of the most important services in this country at work, Mr. Speaker? Why not, Mr. Speaker? Now this takes me to public servants, Mr. Speaker. And I heard a member from Soufre say he supports his government cutting the salaries of public servants. And I want him to help me understand, Mr. Speaker, the logic behind this. If our economy was doing so well and we were about to take off, why do we need to cut salaries, Mr. Speaker? We were told that they only need the reductions for 3 months, only 3 months. Government would save, I think, about 15 million monthly, so that's about $45 million. Now April is gone and salaries were paid in full. Does that mean the reduction is for only 2 months? Because you projected how it would improve over the next few months, and you needed it for 3 months, April, May, June. So April was paid. So are you only asking for a reduction for 2 months now? Now this government is boasting of a drop in debt-to-GDP ratio, and a member shouted it at me. But if the government has a lower debt-to-GDP ratio, can that government not go and borrow that money and spare the public servants the hardship and the anguish and the suffering? You have a better debt-to-GDP ratio, you have more space to borrow. Why can't you borrow and spare people the hardship and the anguish? And of course the argument has been put forward. Withdrawing $45 million of monies that can be spent on consumption must have an effect on the economy. I've never heard Flo, Lucilec, Digicel or Marcy announce that they will be accepting bonds. So obviously those are monies that will be withdrawn from the economy. But you know what really baffles me, Mr. Speaker? And I want the member to explain that to me. And I know the member from Ancillary Candidates is gearing up to come to answer me. So I want him to answer this one for me. I want him to. If the government goes on the regional market to issue a bond, they would be paying between 5 and 6% return, interest, if they go to the regional market or local investors. Even if we argue that this is a short-term instrument and it's more like a treasury bill, a one-year treasury bill, government would be paying 4% on average. So why are public servants being offered 3%? If you float a bond, a long-term instrument, it's 5 to 6%, maybe a little higher. If you do a one-year treasury bill, it's about 4%. And I can quote, if I had time, the last flotation we had in March and April, what the rates were. Why are you offering public servants 3%? So first you're asking them to share the sacrifice, that in times like this we should all sacrifice. Then you insult them. It's a grave insult. Hear what the Prime Minister said on Sunday night. He says the 3% is 1% above the saving rate. So he's telling public servants, just be happy you're getting more than 2%, which is the saving rate. I think it's an insult, because if you issue a bond to investors, you give them 5 to 6%. If you do a treasury bill, you're paying 3%, 4%, but you give public servants 3%. Why can public servants not be given 4%, as you would if a one-year treasury bill? Like somebody said to me, Mr. Speaker, it's like your boss telling you he don't have enough money to pay you this month, but you see adding a new piece to his house or to the business. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask a question, Mr. Speaker. Last week it was boasted that all ministers taking a 75% cut on their salary. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I want to know how many ministers on the other side took a 75% cut in their April salary. Put up your hands. Let the people of St. Lucia see you. All ministers, Mr. Speaker, my apologies. Because we were told all ministers are taking a 75% cut in their salary. Salaries were paid last week. Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member Hans Larry Congress, can you tell me?
No, it's the joker of civil, so let's move on.
Honorable Member, don't go there.
Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, for the standing orders, I can actually ask you to tell him to bring his salary statement to prove that to the House. Inform him of the standing orders before he misbehaves. And if he did not pay 75%, he can be thrown out of the House. I hope he knows that. Kindly inform him,
Honorable
Mr.
Member
Speaker.
continues.
Okay, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to go quickly, Mr. Speaker. And this one really hurts me, Mr. Speaker. We heard that the IMF gave a loan, 29.2 million US, which is about $72 million, Mr. Speaker. The member from Constituency said this morning that that loan is to help out, Mr. Speaker, for health-related expenditures and income support to ease the impact of COVID, Mr. Speaker. Look at page 16, 614 to 616, Mr. Speaker. All members look at it. That IMF loan, what are we using it for, Mr. Speaker? National Apprenticeship Program. Ojo Labs, that's there. We were told in this House that Ojo Labs were being paid under the National Apprenticeship Program, Mr. Speaker. The IMF Rapid Credit Facility loan is being used for National Apprenticeship Program to give to Ojo Labs, Mr. Speaker, at a time like this. The relocation of the Bosajo Agricultural Station, Mr. Speaker. DSH project. DSH, our IMF loan, which is supposed to be for income support and health related, Mr. Speaker. The member from Constituency is pointed out some of the others, Mr. Speaker. The closure of the Viewfort solid waste facility, Mr. Speaker. DSH again, Mr. Speaker. So we are using monies we got from the IMF alone, Mr. Speaker, and we're spending it on projects, Mr. Speaker, that are not related to the purpose for which we got it, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I will come back in the policy to talk about the IMF loan. The last time the St. Lucia drew under the RCF, the Rapid Credit Facility, there were conditions attached to it. And the Labour Party came into power just after. And the IMF had to remind us of the commitments made by the United Workers' Party government under the RCF that were not kept. The Honourable Prime Minister will have to tell this House what are the conditions under which St. Lucia is drawing on that money under the IMF, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how much time I have there? 5 minutes? Mr. Speaker, It's very difficult to take this budget seriously, Mr. Speaker. I wish I had more time, because I still have a lot more I want to say, Mr. Speaker. I never thought an hour could have gone by so fast. But, Mr. Speaker, we are borrowing massively, $500 odd million, Mr. Speaker. And that money is not going to the people, the poor people that are most affected by COVID. There are people who have not worked, Mr. Speaker, who don't qualify for NIC or non-NIC contributors, but they too are suffering out there. And we are borrowing monies, Mr. Speaker, and they are being used essentially on capital projects, Mr. Speaker. In this year, we have the largest capital expenditure since this government has come in, because elections is coming, Mr. Speaker. Elections, and almost a huge increase, over $50 million more. Monies have been borrowed not to ensure the survival of our people in this country, but monies have been borrowed, Mr. Speaker, for election promotion purposes. Mr. Speaker, we are asking public servants to take a cut, Mr. Speaker, yet the budget shows increased allocation for wages and salaries. I don't understand that one, Mr. Speaker. How you show an increase in allocation for wages and salaries, and you're asking for a cut, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I believe people matter more than projects. I believe so, Mr. Speaker. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that our economy will recover from COVID. The whole economy will recover from COVID. I believe that. But I ask every single day, will some people ever recover from the consequences of COVID? I thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Ancillary Canneries.
Another increase in salaries and wages is as a result of the collective agreement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
It is a deferment, it is not a cut. The bonds have to be paid. You have to pay them back after the year with 2% interest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand to give my fullest and strongest support to the estimates of expenditures and revenues. Mr. Speaker, following a year where St. Lucia's economy was on stream to take off to unprecedented levels of success, came COVID-19, sending the regional and global economic outlook, Mr. Speaker, into a severe shock. Mr. Speaker, the world economy slowed down slightly in 2019 from 3.6% in 2018 to 3% in 2018. This was reflective, Mr. Speaker, in the pace of growth shown in all three of our major tourism markets. Mr. Speaker, the scenario in the United States suggested that while they grew in the year 2018 by 2.4%, by the time they had got to 2019, that figure had slowed down to 1.8%, Mr. Speaker. In the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, where Brexit dominated the political discourse of that country and it brought about uncertainty, economic growth, Mr. Speaker, in our second largest tourism market slowed from 2.6% in 2018 to 1.5% in 2019. Mr. Speaker, in Canada, the story was very much the same, whereby we see that the Canadian economy slowed from 2.2% in 2018 to 2.0% in 2019. And so, Mr. Speaker, I find it extremely surprising when we hear suggestions that the economy under this administration is somehow underperforming because, like the rest of the world, like our three main tourism markets, that we too slowed down in the pace of economic growth from 3.5%, Mr. Speaker, but still, Mr. Speaker, achieving and attaining very healthy growth, Mr. Speaker, going to the pace at 1.7%. So, Mr. Speaker, the major economies in the Caribbean also slowed down in their pace of growth, whilst the ECCU region slowed down from 3.9% in 2018 to 3.3% in 2019. Mr. Speaker, it is in this environment of global and regional slowing down and uncertainty of growth that St. Lucia recorded an economic growth rate of 1.7% in 2019. Mr. Speaker, while January 2020 may not have been clear how slow the global and regional growth rates and coronavirus would impact the local economic situation, it became clear, Mr. Speaker, in the last 2 months of this financial year what the impact of coronavirus is. Mr. Speaker, it's well documented, and the world, Mr. Speaker, knows what's happening. Mr. Speaker, in the year 2008, when the crash actually hit the United States and indeed the world, what we did see, Mr. Speaker, was the unemployment claims in the U.S. economy in any given week was 750,000. But, Mr. Speaker, with coronavirus in comparison, there were unemployment claims of 6.2 million unemployment claims, Mr. Speaker, by the American consumers. Mr. Speaker, this is the sheer devastation that has hit the world economy. We see the second largest economy in the world, the Chinese economy, slowing down significantly. Mr. Speaker, we see the great lockdown. The IMF has rated this, Mr. Speaker, worse than 9/11, worse than the 2008 crash, worse than the 1987 stock market crash, and, Mr. Speaker, worse than the economic uncertainty that has came about with the Gulf Wars. What they have indeed said, Mr. Speaker, is that this has been the worst economic crisis the world has seen in 75 years. And so, Mr. Speaker, when I come to this House today and I hear people debate the economic situation of our country as if we're living in a red bubble, as if St. Lucia is an island by itself and we can just get up and make our own rules, as if our economy is not a small, vulnerable economy, Mr. Speaker, that is susceptible to the shocks that are taking place from external forces, that is having a devastating impact on larger economies with greater capacity than ours, Mr. Speaker. And so when I hear the arguments that have been put forward by my colleagues to my right, Mr. Speaker, I am left with no conclusion that they are indeed living in a red bubble. But, Mr. Speaker, that red bubble is dangerous to the recovery that's required to take us out of this scenario. Mr. Speaker, what is required now is decisive and sure leadership. Mr. Speaker, part of my reason for supporting these estimates is the outstanding fiscal performance in some areas. And so, Mr. Speaker, while we've heard a lot of arguments about debt, and I'll get to that, a lot of their figures are bloated. But Mr. Speaker, let's deal with the unemployment rate, which has been one of the strong points of this estimates and expenditure and the last financial year. Mr. Speaker, we see that unemployment in the year 2016, Mr. Speaker, stood at 24.4% in the year 2014 rather. Mr. Speaker, in the last fiscal year, the unemployment rate came down to 16.8%, the best it has been in 10 years. Mr. Speaker, now, we can talk about GDP growth. We can talk about surpluses. We can talk about primary balances. But Mr. Speaker, you know, the indication as to when your economy is performing and is benefiting people, when you want to know whether what you're doing, Mr. Speaker, from an economic policy point of view, and whether it is indeed reaching your people, what you look at, Mr. Speaker, is your unemployment number and your job numbers. And Mr. Speaker, we have performed in that area. So, Mr. Speaker, this red bubble that they live in, that seems to want to manufacture their own numbers, that seems to want to, Mr. Speaker, inflate the fiscal situation of the country for political benefit, is really sad and unfortunate. And Mr. Speaker, we will not allow it. The facts are clear. Mr. Speaker, I go on again, Mr. Speaker, and there is more good news that came out from the previous financial years. Mr. Speaker, youth unemployment, it hovered, Mr. Speaker, and as a young politician, I remember coming into the politics, and one of the figures I remembered that in 2014, that almost 1 in every 2 young persons in this country had no jobs, had no hope, had no future. We had an administration in power, Mr. Speaker, that didn't know what they were doing. But all of these same men are here, Mr. Speaker, trying to tell us what to do. Mr. Speaker, there has been absolutely no new solutions that they have put forward in this honorable house today in the debate so far. And so the youth unemployment rate, Mr. Speaker, that they don't want to tell the public, went down, Mr. Speaker, by 10 percentage points, but by 25 percentage, Mr. Speaker. So by 25%, the youth unemployment rate has come down over the last 10 years. And this is because we have managed this economy well. So, Mr. Speaker, the numbers are all over in the Social Economic Review. The experts in the Ministry of Finance, they took the time and put it together so that we can come and have a sensible debate that is based on empirical evidence. But the opposition want to stay in this red bubble. They want to manufacture their own facts. Whether it's about coronavirus, whether it's about employment numbers, Mr. Speaker, these numbers don't lie, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, other positive economic fundamentals articulated in the last financial year is a debt-to-GDP ratio. The opposition cannot talk about debt. How can you? You sent this country bankrupt. If you look at what has happened in the Social Economic Review, Mr. Speaker, it is clear how much in the billions they have borrowed. And they borrowed, Mr. Speaker, and they got negative growth. And they want to criticize the government for getting growth. Come on, guys, get out of the red bubble. Get out of the red bubble. The numbers are here and clear to see, Mr. Speaker. As the rebasing of the economy, and I heard the leader of the opposition, who prides himself as one of the country's foremost accountants, said that the economy rebased, and so the economic performance that we saw. Mr. Speaker, the rebasing took place between the years 2006 to 2018. And so, Mr. Speaker, all their years as well benefited from the rebasing of the economy. And so, Mr. Speaker, it's clear in one of the boxes in the Social Economic Review, I think it's in page 14, that it's there for them to see. And so, Mr. Speaker, a very strong number is the debt-to-GDP ratio. It's come down to below prudential limits. It's now at 59 point something, 59.8 is what the exact figure would suggest.
9.6.
And so, Mr. Speaker, that shows you that thus far, the country is in a good trajectory going forward. Now, the Prime Minister did indicate, and we're very transparent in the manner in how we manage this economy. He said, listen, we're building an airport, an asset to expand the capacity and the competitiveness of this tourism-dependent economy. Let us not pretend like COVID is going to be with us forever. We have got to plan, Mr. Speaker, to go beyond the COVID years. And so, Mr. Speaker, after COVID, what is the economy going to be looking like? What will the infrastructure require? As we seek to expand tourism and create more opportunity for people in business, in jobs, in ensuring that they can look after their families, Mr. Speaker, what are some of those infrastructure that we need to look at? We can't wait until that time arrives. We have to start planning from now. But the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, doesn't know a thing about planning. Because what they do, you put them to build a hospital, they don't build it in 5 years, they come 5 years later and blame the other government for not building the hospital. That is the kind of politics that they play. They spoke about civil servant salaries. And Mr. Speaker, allow me here, I want to empathize with all of those individuals in the civil service, all of our workers. I mean, I see the police officers in this room, that they are coming out and it's now 9 o'clock in the night. And they are giving up their all, Mr. Speaker. We have nurses at the hospital. I see the people who are on the front line in this time of COVID-19. And I see, Mr. Speaker, how hard they all try. Mr. Speaker, I have a great team at the Ministry of Tourism. And they push very, very hard to ensure that we serve this country. We are on a path right now to try to ensure that we serve as many people as possible, make sure that we let the locals know that the tourism law is on their side. And you've got some amazing civil servants, teachers in my constituency who would push their hands in their pockets and buy lunch for students, and to buy school books and to support parents that they know that need that help because they see a child has the potential. And so, Mr. Speaker, all of us are aware of that. And all of us, it's not an easy decision that we went into a room and just took a guillotine and said, the first thing we do is slash everybody's salaries. But Mr. Speaker, we are leading by example. While everybody else has a 50% salary deferment, Mr. Speaker, we're taking a 75% salary deferment as a cabinet. Because we believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. And so, Mr. Speaker, it's a difficult decision. And so far, it is the most difficult decision that I have ever had. I've got friends, I've got family members, I've got people I care about who are in the police force and who are working in central government and who have their loans to pay and their mortgages to pay. It's a real situation. But, Mr. Speaker, when the government revenue people tell you that the revenues go from 110 million to 40 million, then what else are you going to do? What other choices do you have as a small country? We don't have the Federal Reserve. We can't print money like the United States does, being the owner of the currency of international trade. Mr. Speaker, we are a small island developing state. And just like every other small island developing state in the world, Mr. Speaker, we have our own set of peculiar vulnerabilities. We have our own set of circumstances. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to say tonight that there is no Minister of Finance has had to deal with a crisis such as the one that our current Minister of Finance is dealing with. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am proud of the way that he has led this country through the corona pandemic. And I have every confidence, Mr. Speaker, that he is the best man in this house today to steer St. Lucia out of the crisis that we're in economically, and we will get out of this crisis. And so, Mr. Speaker, my friends to my right, they are in a red bubble, Mr. Speaker. They live in their own rules. They have their own economic realities. Money is no problem for them unless that they are in power. I mean, I remember what they did to a former Minister of Finance. The member for Castries North will know very well that when he was negotiating with the civil servants to pay them 14%, and he asked for one more month, the then opposition St. Lucia Labour Party said a promise was a promise and told the then United Workers' Party administration that they should meet the obligation regardless of what the financial situation was. They scraped the barrel and paid the 14% increase in salary increases to the civil servants. When the United Workers' Party lost the elections, the Labour Party sang a different tune at the next negotiation. And so you know what they said, Mr. Speaker? For the next 3 financial years, their proposal was 0, 0, 0. But Mr. Speaker, they went further than that. They proposed a pay cut of 5% to the civil servants. At least we're giving them bonds. At least we're saying that you can go get 3% on 50% of your deferred pay. But what they proposed, Mr. Speaker, was a 5% cut across the board. The people, Mr. Speaker, who are below grade 7 were not spared the wrath of their guillotine and their insensitivity. The people from grade 1 to 6 that are in that little safeguard now were not spared of the Labour Party's proposal of 5% cut. But you see, Mr. Speaker, history is today repeating itself. Because if the St. Lucia Labour Party was in power with a revenue of 110 million, revenue falling from 110 million to 40 million, and having to pay 40 million a month in salaries, Mr. Speaker, 43 million, and another 27 million in servicing their debt. Mr. Speaker, there's no way any of us can do it. And so it can't be possible because you're in opposition and you can say anything you want and live in your red bubble. Come on, man. This is a serious matter. And I get really annoyed when I see such cheap politics. And my simple advice to you guys is stop it. Stop it. Let's elevate the politics.
And remember, don't know.
Let's elevate the debate, Mr. Speaker, through you, Mr. Speaker. Let's elevate the debate in this House, and let us, Mr. Speaker, focus on the realities. Let us get out of our red bubble, and let us, Mr. Speaker, look at what's happening in the world. Mr. Speaker, look at the United States of America, the greatest economy in the world. The government is pumping money into major corporations. The local populace are looking at CNN. They are more intelligent than the nonsense you're trying to spew here today. Mr. Speaker, through you, sorry about that. Mr. Speaker, the nonsense that the opposition is spewing and have spewed all day. Mr. Speaker, right? The people of St. Lucia, they are more intelligent than that. And so, Mr. Speaker, I go on to other rates of success and other signs of success. Let's go to GDP growth. Let's talk about economic management now. And I am not going to say, I'm going to let the Social Economic Review do the talking. And this is what it says, Mr. Speaker. In Table 2, and I want you to follow me, Member for Labrie, if you will. Page 100, go there with me. We're having a Bible study tonight. And so, Mr. Speaker, in the year 2016, let's go. Follow me. You're afraid because you want to live in a red bubble. Mr. Speaker, This is what the Social Economic Review says. Table 2 on page 100. It says, Mr. Speaker, that St. Lucia had 4 consecutive years of magnificent growth. And I'm going to list those numbers for you. And I know the member for Castries South is watching on television because he said a lot of things and I want him to come back in this house. I'm waiting for him to come back. Because, Mr. Speaker, he told a lot of mistruths tonight. And the numbers that he put up about the debt are completely wrong. And I'm waiting for him to come back because I need to look him in the eye to tell him that he got it wrong again. But, Mr. Speaker, in 2016, the economic performance of the country, the gross domestic product, was at 3.4%. If I lie, tell me, and I will end my debate right now. In 2017, it was 3.5%. In 2018, there was again growth of 2.6%. And in 2019, Mr. Speaker, the last financial year, it was at 1.9%. Now let us compare the previous 4 years and all the economic management, all the scholarly thesis that they want to come and preach to the people. Mr. Speaker, the false prophets are back, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member.
We compare.
Honorable
Yes.
member. Temper yourself.
I will be guided by you, Mr. Speaker, as always. And so, Mr. Speaker, let's compare the last 4 years of magnificent growth. Unprecedented. This is like manna from heaven to this country. Because, Mr. Speaker, the years before that, we were in a complete economic famine, Mr. Speaker, in 2012. In 2012, Mr. Speaker, the economic growth was negative, 0.1% economic growth. In 2013, Mr. Speaker, it was worse than the year before, minus 2.0%. So we went deeper in a hole. All the math and the numbers, this is what you do, the results. We are results-oriented people. In 2014, Mr. Speaker, it went to 1.3%, which is still less than our worst year in government. Their best year, Mr. Speaker, is worse than our worst year. So how is there a comparison? How can you even talk? How could you even find the audacity to speak on economic management when all you have accomplished is absolutely ridiculous? I mean, Mr. Speaker, 2015, 0.1%. It barely wants to get above zero, Mr. Speaker. That's how bad it is. And these numbers are painstaking. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the funny thing about this is while they made excuses, I remember the member for Mikud North was the leader of the opposition at that time. And she sat over there and she told the member for Vieux-Fort South that he was the worst economic manager of the OECS. He presided over the slowest economy in the OECS. That was true, Mr. Speaker. The ECCB published a report and said that St. Lucia was the slowest economy. And so, Mr. Speaker, you know what he said? Is that she ought to have given him the credit for the deceleration of negative growth. Mr. Speaker, it is the first time in the history of my life I have ever heard someone asking you to praise them when they have not passed the exam. So what he's saying is that I failed, but I came closer to passing than I did the last time. So therefore, you should compliment me. No, if you fail, Mr. Speaker, you fail. And that is it. A failure is a failure. So when you are going to come and prescribe and give advice, and you know, Mr. Speaker, what was so funny about this whole thing? And the member for Castries South said that they suspended the politics, right? We sat in this room yesterday. We went through the Public Finance Committee. We presented this entire book. We're so transparent. And we said, knock yourselves out. If you want to make a comment, go ahead. Nobody on this side said nothing. As soon as the cameras come on, Mr. Speaker, they have the most things to say. This is all a game on their part, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry for saying that. But, Mr. Speaker, there is no truth attached to this, to their contributions here tonight. It is all theater. It is all to score points, Mr. Speaker. I mean, Mr. Speaker, in keeping with that, my good friend here from Castries South, I mean, if you're going to come to the house, the honorable house where the laws are made, and Mr. Speaker, when you go through the Hansard, I challenge you to find that I ever lied to this house. Because, Mr. Speaker, I don't need to do that. Because I've got numbers tonight to back me up. The gentleman here tonight suggested that we have risen the debt by $1.3 billion. That's what he said. And he went to use the most moving source, which is the estimate. It's called an estimate. Mr. Speaker, through you, if I can just lecture the member for a moment. This is called an estimate. And so, Mr. Speaker, the numbers here are not cast in stone because they're projections. And so, Mr. Speaker, how are you going to use the estimate when the Social and Economic Review has showed you a full picture of what the debt is? And so the Social Economic Review, Mr. Speaker, has exposed him by $1 billion. Now, if you're going to lie, if you're going to lie by $500, but not $1 billion, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member.
$1 billion.
Mr. Speaker,
Honorable member.
On a point of order.
What's the point of order, honorable member? Catch yourself. Honorable members, I know Honorable member, ancillary plenaries.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Mr.
Speaker.
Honorable member.
Mr. Speaker. Yes, sir.
I know we at the time of the night when I guess the extra hormones of the day. I would like to remain standing, honorable member. Honorable member.
Yes, sir.
I would just like to remind you. You didn't do it, but I would like to remind you. It is unparliamentary.
Yes,
you didn't
sir.
do it, but I'm telling, just putting you on caution, it is unparliamentary to call members liars.
Oh, I didn't really.
No,
I'm
didn't do it. I'm just
Speaker. Sure.
ahead of time.
Okay, so Mr. Speaker, let me rephrase that. If you're going to misrepresent the facts, right? Misrepresent the facts by $500. But don't
Mr. Speaker,
misrepresent
on a
the
point of
facts
order. Can I?
by $1 billion.
On a point of order,
Mr. Speaker.
Please sit. Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members,
Mr.
I'm
Speaker.
saying again that the time, I know the time of night. Let's keep the... Maybe we should now extend the protocol and have members to, and just keep the basic quorum.
Yeah. I don't think the
Honorable member, we need to get back to what we were earlier today.
I agree.
Okay. Now,
Just point out to the honorable member that there is a summary page that actually says actual. Actual means, on this page, it is confirmed in that. And you could probably explain to him, Mr. Speaker, it has actual. There is no misleading the House. These are official documents of the House. It says actual for the year, whichever year. So you take all the estimates where it says actual, and then you add them. There's no misleading out. Probably you could explain to him about the estimates and how it is structured. He says he wants to lecture me. Mr. Speaker, please give him the lecture for me that he deserves.
Honorable member.
So, Mr. Speaker, the social...
Honorable member.
Yes, sir.
Member for Castries South is indicating that the figures he used in coming up to if the 1.3 it was, honorable member, that were the actual figures as...
So, Mr. Speaker, let's clear this up. Mr. Speaker, just take your social economic review and let me take you through the steps. So, Mr. Speaker, in the year 2016, the debt stood at $3,071,409,000. Mr. Speaker, in 2019, it says that the debt now stands at, it increased to $3,417,597,000. Mr. Speaker, a difference of $346,188,000. The member said in his presentation that thus far we have risen the debt by $1.3 billion. And that is not true, because up to the year 2019, the difference is $346 million. We're talking about the Alan Shasdale-led administration. If he wants to go back to Sir John Compton, that's a long time ago, right? But if we go there, he can't win that. So what he has done, Mr. Speaker, is that he has inflated the figures by $1 billion. So he has misrepresented the truth, not by 500, but by $1 billion. And that's what I'm saying. So, but it's here, Mr. Speaker. And I would love to walk him through the numbers, because that is what he has done. And this is not, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to rise on the point of order, but we would be here all night going through a mistruth. So when I waited, Mr. Speaker, I was speaking after. Here we are. But, Mr. Speaker, it is important, especially at this time, as we are going through such a real pandemic and a real sensitive time of our history, that we must be in line. We cannot make such silly mistakes. And so, Mr. Speaker, the question was asked. And so, Mr. Speaker, the question was asked tonight. The question was asked tonight. Why not consult?
Honorable Prime Minister. What? Honorable Prime Minister. Honorable Prime Minister.
So the question was asked tonight, Mr. Speaker. Why not consult the leader of the opposition in putting together the economic stimulus plan? So, Mr. Speaker, the response to that is very simple, right? The response to the member's comment is very simple. The leader of the opposition simply went ahead and had his own stimulus package. He addressed the nation. Who did he consult when he did that? Nobody cried foul. He went ahead and addressed the nation. And we're fine with that, Mr. Speaker. That's fine. But when we go ahead and organize ourselves, which we are duty-bound to do to the people of St. Lucia, then how could you come? How could you then come? I mean, what is going on in this house, Mr. Speaker? As we go through the night, I find it so hard to believe that members are actually taking their time to write such ridiculous points on paper. Because, Mr. Speaker, it is clear, all of St. Lucia saw the leader of the, I think it was about $245 million of Father Christmas presents. I mean, his list was so long, right, that you have to ask yourself, what informed it, right? But it is all about politics, Mr. Speaker. He said tonight, Mr. Speaker, that somehow they had put aside the politics to give us space. Now, if the politics was aside, why did the leader of the opposition have to go and announce the nation? What was that? What was that, charity? That looks like politics to me, Mr. Speaker. That wasn't charity. Don't pretend. I mean, what did he say tonight, Coco Maca? That was a Coco Maca statement. Whatever you say. So, Mr. Speaker, there was no putting aside of the politics. What we had tonight, Mr. Speaker, what we had tonight, Mr. Speaker, what we had tonight is crocodile tears. What we had tonight, Mr. Speaker, was an opposition that is not serious about the issues of this country. What we had tonight, Mr. Speaker, is an opposition that says one thing on the one hand and something else on the other hand. Look, Mr. Speaker, you would recall, right in this honorable house, recess time, you were going down the stairs, and social media was abuzz with it. Our Prime Minister went over to that side to shake the hands of Honorable Dr. Kenny Anthony. And you know
Honorable
what he
member,
did?
you do
He
not.
refused
Honorable member.
the member for Viewford South. That's publicized. The member for Viewford South. And the Prime Minister's outstretched hands was there, Mr. Speaker, left to languish without a response from the member for Viewford South. And the
Honorable
member for
member,
Castries South will
Let me
tonight
just
talk about tribalism.
indicate to you
Yes, sir.
what is before the House, and I will not tell you what to say, but you must always tie to what is before the House.
Yes, so
Continue,
Mr.
sir.
Speaker, the member for Castries South today spoke about tribalism and said that all we have done, in his own words, and you could check the Hansard, all we have done is to be vindictive, is to enhance tribalism. And so, Mr. Speaker, on that note, I am trying to say tonight that if that is the case, why is it when the Prime Minister went on that side to shake the hands of the member for Viewford South, that his hands were left there languishing, outstretched, with no response? And so that is it, Mr. Speaker. On the one hand, they speak about unity, but do something else. And so, Mr. Speaker, I don't have time for their red bubble, and I don't have time, Mr. Speaker, for the nonsense that they continue to spew in this House. Mr. Speaker,
Honorable member, that's
It
the
was
second time. Stop the word nonsense, and I will ask you that you withdraw it right. That
Mr.
word
Speaker,
right
I
now.
withdraw the word nonsense.
Thank you very much.
I'll be guided by you. But I will, it is such, it is so ridiculous, Mr. Speaker, what we've heard. So today we spoke about balance of payments, the member for Castries South, and said that the balance of payments, I mean, he just seems to be in the habit of getting it wrong all the time. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry that I have to bore you with such irrelevant detail, but it clearly shows, Mr. Speaker, he says the balance of payments were among the most outrageous in our time. Am I lying? Yeah? The balance of payments. And so, Mr. Speaker, you spoke about the deficits. Spoke about the deficits. Right. So, Mr. Speaker, in 2013, we see that the 2012-2013 financial year, we see that the overall balance was $328.8 million. Mr. Speaker, in 24, yeah, negative, yeah, that's a deficit. We see there was a deficit in 2013-2014 of $216.5 million. We see in financial year 2014-2015, there's a deficit of $138.9 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, a real government arrives in 2016, and it goes down to 106.3, minus 79, minus 111, minus 57 in the year 2018-2019. And Mr. Speaker, last year was 193.8. Mr. Speaker, when you do the average across and you see, I never like to tell a story in a snippet. When you tell a story in a snippet, Mr. Speaker, you just get a snapshot. And you never can really tell what's happening. But when you go across the spectrum, you get a very good idea as to what is really taking place, Mr. Speaker, in a period of time. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is clear the St. Lucia Labour Party is in no place to talk about fiscal responsibility, because all they have done in their history is to send St. Lucia bankrupt. And the history is there to show it. Come on. So we should not even be wasting our time, because the information that are put together by the staff in the Ministry of Finance, who have done a great job, is here to show that the balances are not in your favor. You should never open your mouth to speak about balances. If you're going to debate where you're strong, right? And all you're strong at is talking, so keep talking. But you never do anything. So, Mr. Speaker, through you, I would like to again go through some other successes of this administration. And you see, Mr. Speaker, this bubble we have seen so far, the red bubble, where they behave like St. Lucia is in this place of shaking a money tree and everything can happen for us. So, Mr. Speaker, as I continue, I want to give my support to other comments that were made here tonight. So the Telethon funds, Mr. Speaker, were spoken about. Now, the member for Castries South suggested that the feeding program is a waste of time. Mr. Speaker, let me take some time to explain. A number of farmers in this country, and I happen to represent a farming constituency, and I want to support the measures in the estimates that are going to the banana productivity program, the agricultural assistance program to farmers that are not planting bananas, the fertilization and irrigation projects that the ministry has coming up. Mr. Speaker, the Telethon funds was raised by the member for Castries South. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to thank St. Lucians, the private sector. I want to thank all the volunteers, the organization committee, for all the work that they have done to put together, Mr. Speaker, something that has brought us all together as a country. And it has really raised monies beyond our expectations. But to suggest that we advertise the money, to put words in the advertising and do something else is offensive. And this government don't operate that way, Mr. Speaker. And so what I'm going to challenge the opposition to do again is to go back and look at the advertising material and then talk. Because, Mr. Speaker, what we did say is that we were raising money for the PPE supplies and the frontline workers and for the national feeding program. Because it was clear, Mr. Speaker, from very, very early on, that what we wanted to do was to support our farming community. And our farming community, Mr. Speaker, that have been displaced from selling supplies to the hotels and to other parts where we would have seen a contraction in the consumption. And so, Mr. Speaker, by purchasing most of the raw materials that go into the feeding program from the marketing board, what we're indeed doing is supporting the local farmers at such a difficult time, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, when they open their mouth, and you have said not to use the word nonsense, please give me another word. But, Mr. Speaker, I find that offensive because we raise those funds with the best of intention to bring about relief and to help in this COVID fight. And I find that offensive because I personally worked on that, and all of the volunteers who came and give their time would also find that offensive, Mr. Speaker. And all of the people who give their money in good faith would find that's a cheap political move for you to say that. And so, Mr. Speaker, we say again, and I want them to challenge me what I say is wrong, that we always said, and go back and check all the interviews, that it was to raise PPE supplies for the frontliners, Mr. Speaker, and also for the food national feeding program. We made that absolutely clear to the people of St. Lucia.
Honourable Member, you have 15 minutes in which to complete your presentation.
I wanted to deal with that and take some time. Mr. Speaker, it was also raised here tonight.
Honourable members,
the government, and Mr. Speaker, why is the government giving the civil servants?
Honourable Member Ancillary, gentlemen. Honourable Prime Minister, Honourable Prime Minister. Honourable Prime Minister, Prime Minister, and Member for Castries.
Mr. Speaker, they have taken 2.5 minutes of my time. I hope you're seeing that. But, Mr. Speaker, the issue of bonds here for the public servants were raised again tonight. And I want to take my time to speak about this. And the question was asked, why we were giving them 3% when the government can get 4 to 6% on the market. But I want to take the time to explain, Mr. Speaker, because I think that the member for Castries South did a dangerous misrepresentation of the truth. Again, as usual. Because, Mr. Speaker, if he is the shadow minister of investment, he is supposed to know. He is the shadow minister of investment on the Labour Party side. He is supposed to know, Mr. Speaker, that if the term of the bond is 1 year, then it will attract a lower interest than a normal government bond, which will go from 1 to 5 years. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to explain that to give clarity to the public servants who might be listening tonight. And it is not that the government is trying in any way to cheat them from their monies, but, Mr. Speaker, we are ascribing to this particular deferment a market situation. And this is what it is on the market, Mr. Speaker. And so I want to make that absolutely clear. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that the member for Castries South should be ashamed of himself again for trying to create such division in this country and trying to set such strife in this country. And, Mr. Speaker, that is unfortunate. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the mode in which he has operated in this House. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to use your good offices to ensure that some level of authenticity come to this debate and some level of truth, Mr. Speaker. And so when we've got the documents to show that this is what it is, how can a member in this House misleads the public by $1 billion? Mr. Speaker, that reminds me of one of the disciples that followed Jesus. He was the treasurer of the money bag. And I'm not going to say anything else. But $1 billion is a big number. And when someone will try to misrepresent the facts by $1 billion, Mr. Speaker, you've got to be careful. And you've got to watch that individual with 4 eyes if you wear spectacles. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to take this time to support some other salient topics that were raised here, Mr. Speaker, on the head number 51, the Department of Social Equity, the capital budget of $2.2 million, Mr. Speaker. I want to support the project on the SSDF, which, Mr. Speaker, builds a early childhood development center in my constituency in Jacmel, where over 120 preschoolers. This will significantly, Mr. Speaker, enhance the capacity of early childhood learning in the community of Jacmel, Roseau, Boaden, Monciso, and Mondor. Mr. Speaker, as the government seeks to stimulate the economy through construction as a result of the devastating impact caused by COVID-19, our economic mainstay, Mr. Speaker, tourism, continues to go through a very difficult time. Mr. Speaker, a number of projects are planned for this financial year under the heading number 56 of the Economic Development and Civil Aviation Department. Mr. Speaker, capital projects totaling $76.7 million is planned to be expended on various projects during the financial year. Mr. Speaker, a lot of these projects are in my constituency, and Mr. Speaker, I want to give support to the allocation under that specific heading and department. Mr. Speaker, we see that this will definitely help the ancillary waterfront transition, Mr. Speaker, in the community to turn it into a tourism mecca via the village tourism project. Mr. Speaker, this much anticipated project includes the scope of works, transition of the old police station building into a mini hotel guest house facility. Mr. Speaker, the demolition of the community center building to become a restaurant targeting the yachting sector and microbrew. Mr. Speaker, the upgrading of the current fish fry facility. Mr. Speaker, the facade improvements to the private residence on the waterfront of the ancillary village is also there for consideration. Mr. Speaker, relocation of the existing laundry facility on the waterfront location and enhancement of the drain around the playing field are some of the projects, Mr. Speaker, that are part of the wide and far-reaching village tourism project slated for my constituency of ancillary. So this will be funded, Mr. Speaker, under the Ministry of Economic Development under our cooperation agreement with the Taiwanese. Mr. Speaker, a lot of jobs will be created both in the construction and also in the operational phase of the project. Mr. Speaker, there are some 14 roads that have been completed in my constituency, in addition to playing fields, rehabilitation, and all of this have come out of the CDP project. Mr. Speaker, another example is the Derendo Community Center, which was closed for 9 years, Mr. Speaker, and today we have been able to transform this into a human resource development center. So far, Mr. Speaker, with the NAPS program on the Monroe College and Monroe College, we have been able to train 100 youth. And had it not been for COVID-19, they would have all been hired by the cruise lines as well as the hotel community, Mr. Speaker. This is part of a larger program, Mr. Speaker, which I believe have trained over 2,000 St. Lucians island-wide in several constituencies, Mr. Speaker, making sure that we get the youth of this country ready for the tourism sector. Mr. Speaker, Head 53, under the Department of Health and Wellness, a total of $31,136,000 was allocated in the allocations of the capital expenditure. I heard a figure spewed tonight, which wasn't the 31 million which was budgeted for the Ministry of Health for COVID-19. I don't know where that came from, Mr. Speaker, but I just want to bring about clarity that the Cabinet's and the government's position on ensuring that we properly fund COVID-19 is $31 million. I think I heard something in the region tonight from the member for Castries South, which was significantly less. Let me clarify that we're extremely committed, Mr. Speaker, to this COVID-19 fight. Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, you have 5 minutes in which to complete.
It was said tonight as well. Previously it was said that we were the worst prepared. And the leader of the opposition said that in an interview. And Mr. Speaker, if we are the worst prepared, how is it, Mr. Speaker? Just a few days ago, the WHO suggested that St. Lucia was among 2 countries out of 170 where we had 0 positive cases. How is that possible? Mr. Speaker, again, facts, Mr. Speaker. We cannot live and manage and run this country from a red bubble. That is dangerous, Mr. Speaker. We've been there before. What we need, Mr. Speaker, is a clinical and strategic look at the leadership of this country. If we're going to conceive ideas, Mr. Speaker, they must be sound. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all the frontline workers. I want to thank the command center staff for the tremendous work they have been doing to help the Ministry of Health in organizing quarantine facilities, in making sure that we bring the Cuban Medical Brigade to help, Mr. Speaker, to beef up the capacity of our local health fraternity. Mr. Speaker, Victoria Hospital has been transitioned to a respiratory facility. Mr. Speaker, Meetings are taking place every single day, and what they talk about is COVID-19, COVID-19, and how do we ensure that we get our people ready? How do we keep our people safe is the number one priority, Mr. Speaker. But as we do so, Mr. Speaker, and we have now, Mr. Speaker, flattened that curve, and we have seen in previous reports where I showed last week, Mr. Speaker, that from March towards the middle of April, where St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, recorded the lowest rate of COVID incidents in the entire Caribbean. In the entire Eastern Caribbean, Mr. Speaker, that was made clear. And so, Mr. Speaker, if that is the case, why is the opposition trying so desperately to send another message or to create another truth? Please do not do this. This is dangerous. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about people's health. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we do that, Mr. Speaker, we create scare tactics. And so my advice to the people of St. Lucia is this: do not listen to fake news. Listen to the official updates from the Ministry of Health. They are the authorities on the subject. Continue to look at the GIS Command Center for updated information on COVID-19. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to tonight, Mr. Speaker, place on record that our commitment as a government remains strong to defeating this pandemic clearly and completely. Mr. Speaker, I want to take some time to talk about the tourism situation in the country. And I know I don't have the time, Mr. Speaker, but I'll speak until you stop me. Mr. Speaker, as we have come to this point, we know now that there were 2 new cases today, as announced by the Prime Minister in conversation with the CMO. And so we've got 2 positive cases. But what we do know, Mr. Speaker, that after mass testing, because I did indicate that there was a mass testing campaign which took place. So we see, Mr. Speaker, very limited evidence of there being significant community transmission taking place. So it means, therefore, that what we have done over the last 6 weeks to 2 months have worked. So now, Mr. Speaker, we've reached to the phase where we need to ask ourselves, how do we reopen our economy? And so, Mr. Speaker, we've started with the construction sector. We've started by gradually opening a lot of our local businesses with protocols. And as we struggle, Mr. Speaker, for revenues, I see today that Anguilla has announced a reopening date of July. We see as well another Caribbean country, which escapes me now, has announced that it is opening up for business. Mr. Speaker, on the 4th of May, which is next Tuesday, the OECS tourism ministers will be meeting to determine a regional position on how to reopen this economy, how to reopen tourism, more importantly. The OECS Tourism Authority, the heads have met, and they have selected our very own Prime Minister, Honorable Alan Chasney, to lead, Mr. Speaker, the whole process of reopening the sub-region, Mr. Speaker. And this whole process has now been taken on by the wider CARICOM. What we have done, Mr. Speaker, is put in a lot of work. We've been working with the officials from Harvard University. We've been working with, as well, the officials from CTO, the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association.
Honourable Member, should be wrapping up now.
Yeah, the OECS Secretariat, and we've worked together, Mr. Speaker, to put together a set of protocols which will, Mr. Speaker, be the new normal for tourism in the Caribbean. So what are those protocols going to be like? How will tourism, Mr. Speaker, live in a COVID environment? And so, Mr. Speaker, as I run out of time, I will wrap up, but in the policy statement, I will give to this House more details on the reopening of the tourism sector in a very phased, structured, and strategic manner, Mr. Speaker, as we look to strike a balance between managing our economy and managing the public health expectation. Mr. Speaker, I want to say to you, thank you very much, and I want to say to the people of St. Lucia finally that this is a critical moment in our history, a time, Mr. Speaker, when we do require decisive, strong, concise leadership.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, if I can just interrupt the minister.
Sure.
On a point of hallucination, Minister, the allegation was made with regards to the statistics and arrivals for the first quarter. And I certainly would appreciate if you could clarify for the House what the arrival numbers for the first quarter was, and in particular for the month of March, Mr. Speaker, because an allegation was made that the Ministry of Statistics and also the Finance Department was misleading and had been misguided in the economic report in suggesting that the tourism numbers were down, Mr. Speaker, for the first quarter. I don't know if the Minister has available with him those numbers. If he can please clarify that point for us.
Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, how do you rule? What's your order, Mr. Speaker? What's your ruling?
Go ahead, Minister. Clarify.
Clarify. So, Mr. Speaker, contrary to what have been said tonight, is that the tourism numbers, they have held, Mr. Speaker, up until February. So, Mr. Speaker, the tourism numbers have held until February. Where we began seeing the dip, Mr. Speaker, was in March. By the time we got to April, then the bottom fell out. But it was, minus 20%. But this was all, Mr. Speaker, done with COVID-19 was the situation. There were hotels, Mr. Speaker, with lots of business on the books, and those businesses disappeared literally in 2 weeks. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will give you a detailed report on the tourism sector and on matters pertaining to my constituency in the policy debate. But thank you, Mr. Speaker, tonight. I know that members are anxious to go home. I want to thank you very much. I want to thank the police officers and the staff from Parliament that are here tonight. I want to thank the GIS team for doing such a magnificent job over these past few weeks and staying these late nights. I want to thank, Mr. Speaker, my staff at the Ministry of Tourism for helping to put together the statistics, the staff in the Ministry of Culture, Creative Industries, also the CDF, the Tourism Authority, and also Event St. Lucia for the tremendous work that they have been doing. Mr. Speaker, I take this opportunity to say to my beloved constituents that they should stay safe and remain very proactive in this time of COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Yes. Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I ask we can adjourn the House until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.
Honorable members, the question is that the House do stand adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As many as of the contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. House is adjourned.
Thank you so much for staying with the broadcast in the evening session. We heard from Parliamentary Representative for Castries South, Honorable Dr. Ernest Hilaire, who indicated that the COVID-19 pandemic calls for leadership and has given the government the opportunity for greater patriotism, and the opposition stands ready to work with the government in the fight. He called for a COVID-19 specific budget, indicating that the law gave latitude for the Prime Minister to spend 3/4 of the previous budget without having to present it formally, and has a period of 4 months after the end of the previous financial year before a new budget is due. He indicated that he wanted some direction as to what was being done and where were the money allocated to, which specific projects and so forth. He did indicate that the constituency of Castries South was in dire need of a number of projects that he highlighted, including drainage work, road rehabilitation, footpaths, lighting, land ownership issues, traffic barriers, access to Wi-Fi, working on community centers or rehabilitation of community centers, courts, and resurfacing of playing fields. The parliamentary representative called for more youth programs as well as they are needed within his constituency. He questioned whether the estimates that were indicated were sufficient to meet the needs of the country. He also questioned the purpose for the funds being obtained via loan from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the conditions stipulated under the terms and conditions of agreement. The Castries South MP accused the government of extreme borrowing, questioning again the allocation of the funds within the estimates of revenue and expenditure 2020-2021. We then heard from Minister for Tourism, Information and Broadcasting, Culture and Creative Industries and Parliamentary Representative for Ancillary Canneries, the Honourable Dominic Fede, who threw his support behind the motion. He noted that despite a slowdown in growth, the island still recorded some growth in the economy in 2019 of 1.7%. The parliamentary representative spoke to the subsequent impact of the COVID-19 pandemic that has decimated economies globally, having the worst economic impact in some 75 years. He explained, however, that the trend indicated that the government was on the right path with unemployment rate from 2014, where it was 24.4%, and declined to 16.8% in 2019, the best in years. The MP highlighted this as a significant indicator of the country's fiscal performance. Youth unemployment rate declined by 25% as well over the last 10 years. He attributes the decline to the proper management of the economy by the government. He also highlighted debt-to-GDP ratio, which is now at 59.6%, a figure below what this ratio is required. He highlighted that the country must continue to move forward and cannot stand still due to COVID-19, and therefore proper planning is necessary. He also commented on the payment of salaries, indicating that the cabinet is leading by example, taking a 25% of salaries in cash and 75% in the bonds. Lastly, he highlighted a number of projects to come on stream in his constituency ancillary canneries, including the transitioning of the old police station to become a guest house, the upgrading of fish frying facility, relocation of existing laundry facility, and the enhancement of the drainage around the field, to name a few. Some 14 roads have been completed along with some other projects. The MP noted that a lot of jobs will be created with the execution of these projects. He also highlighted the NAPS program conducted in collaboration with the Monroe College, which has seen some 100 individuals trained in the hospitality sector. MP Fede noted that these individuals would have gained employment on cruise ships and in the hospitality sector had it not been for the COVID-19 pandemic. He assured, however, that the government is working assiduously to ensure that everyone affected would be provided some sort of relief at the soonest. Lastly, OECS tourism ministers will meet on the 4th of May 2020 to decide as to a strategic way of reopening the region to tourism, instituting the necessary protocols, and how to continue with the sector going forward. Once again, thank you so much for staying with us at this sitting of Parliament. We'll be back at 9 a.m. tomorrow, Thursday, 30th April. Good night.